Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. If everyone can just hold on one second, I'm trying to get my screen to show to everybody. Let's see here. Hey, Eric, do you see my PowerPoint, or do you just see the planning for broadband?
No, just the planning for broadband.
Interesting. Okay, well, we're just going to have to roll with it until maybe the system decides to wake up and work. Okay, so hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of APA. And wait, I'm determined here. Yes, yay, I think we got it now. And I'm chair of the New Urbanism Division, and I'm your webcast moderator. Today is April 6th, and we will be hearing the presentation Planning for Broadband. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or you can call the 1-800 number shown there in bold. And for your content questions related to the presentation, you can type those in the questions box, again, located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen. And we'll answer those questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. On your screen is a list of our sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2018. Thanks to all the participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. If you're looking down the list and you don't see your chapter or division listed, we just ask that you reach out to them and say, hey, you need to join. Today's webcast is sponsored by the Technology Division of APA, and you can learn more about them and all the divisions at planning.org/divisions. Coming up on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. You can register for these by visiting our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, head over to planning.org and log into your MyAPA account. And from there, up at the top, under your CM log, you can search for CM activities. And you can either put in the event number or the title of today's webcast, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And this webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. We do have some recorded webcasts that are available for distance education, one law, one ethics, both worth 1.5 credits. And you can check out the distance education opportunities on our webcast webpage. And like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our sessions. We are recording today's webcast. It will be available on our YouTube channel at the end of the session. Just head over to YouTube and search Planning Webcast. And we'll have a PDF of the presentation available at the end on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Okay, I'd like to quickly introduce our speaker and then turn it over to him. Eric Frederick. He serves as Vice President for Community Affairs for Connected Nation, a national 501c3 organization with a mission to improve quality of life through the expanded access, adoption, and use of broadband technology. Mr. Frederick is a broadband community planning expert and a sought-after speaker on broadband and technology issues with 11 years of experience working with local to international stakeholders to improve the access, adoption, and use of broadband. Mr. Frederick's long-term and comprehensive approach to technology-focused community development provides the hundreds of communities and thousands of stakeholders engaged by Connected Nation with wide-ranging insights, education, and solutions to create digitally inclusive and equitable communities. Eric holds a master's in urban planning and regional planning from Michigan State University and a bachelor's of science in urban planning and GIS from Northern Michigan University. Additionally, Eric is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners and a leadership in energy and environmental design accredited professional. Additionally, Eric serves on the Educational Committee for the American Planning Association and co-leads the Digital Inclusion Task Force as part of APA's Technology Division. With that, turn it over to Eric.
All right, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
All right, and can you see my PDF there?
Yes.
All right, good to go then. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and welcome to everybody from beautiful, sunny, gorgeous Spring, Michigan. I'm kidding, we had an inch of snow on the ground this morning. I thank you for joining us and to look at a topic that's something that I'm passionate about, that Connected Nation is passionate about, and that's working to improve broadband connectivity and the adoption and use of technology in every community across the country, but particularly in rural areas where that connectivity does sometimes not exist. So what I want to talk to you today about is provide a little bit of context about why we're talking about technology and where we're coming from, and a little bit of our history, since planning for broadband isn't necessarily something that's done very often or is very commonplace. We'll talk about the why it's important to have an equitable community when it comes to broadband and technology, how that's done, and then we'll give some examples from communities across the country that are working to address their broadband challenges. Then, of course, take your questions. Broadband and technology are very, very big topics with many implications and facets for communities of all sizes and scales. So please, any questions that you have, please go ahead and throw those out there, and we'll do our best to answer those at the end. Again, it's a very broad topic. It'd be like diving into any infrastructure topic in detail. So there's no dumb questions here. So please feel free to ask away. Just a little bit of context. I know a little bit was covered at the beginning, but I'm the VP of Community Affairs for Connected Nation, and we are a nonprofit that works to expand broadband access, adoption, and use for improved quality of life. You're going to hear that phrase, access, adoption, and use, quite a bit today, and I'll get into the meaning of those here in a little bit. But we are not a broadband provider. We play in a very strange space between the private sector broadband providers as well as between public entities to really help raise both sides of the issue so that everybody can be better connected, because we do believe that everyone belongs in a connected nation. So we do that through a number of different ways. We do network mapping and validation and analysis, so figuring out where broadband is and is not. We do lots of broadband technology research to figure out what households are, or more importantly, are not adopting technology at home. And we also do the same thing for businesses and institutions. We do a lot of local, state, and national policy analysis and capacity building. So again, making sure everybody is aware of the issues of broadband and how it impacts our communities. And back between 2009 and 2015, we worked in 14 states implementing the Department of Commerce's State Broadband Initiative. So again, doing all these activities at a state and local level. But most importantly, we have a program called Connected. That's a community technology planning program. So my background is, of course, in planning, and now I get to apply that to technology. So Connected is a framework for creating local broadband and technology plans that has been implemented across the country. So I'm going to share some of the experiences of that, some of the knowledge of that, and how broadband planning can work and how you could implement it wherever you're at and at your scale, and then take your questions from there. So I told you that I was going to mention the phrase access, adoption, and use quite a bit. And here's what those things mean. So instead of just focusing on infrastructure, which is absolutely critical to improving communities and accessing technology, we don't want to just stop at infrastructure. The build it and they will come model of broadband infrastructure deployment does not work. So we want to make sure that we're looking at a spectrum of issues when it comes to broadband for community development. So first and foremost, of course, though, is access, the availability of that physical connection to high-speed internet. Next is adoption. So that's making sure that residents, businesses, institutions are recognizing the value in having an internet connection or a broadband connection at home and subscribing. And then, of course, the use is making sure that all of those entities have the skills and applications they need to leverage that technology to, again, improve quality of life and community and economic development. So if you want to think it in terms of supply and demand, access and availability would be the supply, while adoption and use is the demand. So we try to work on both ends of this spectrum so that we can improve infrastructure to meet demand, raise demand to expand and improve infrastructure, and so on. It's an important step to make sure that we don't just stop at infrastructure. So we do take this comprehensive approach to broadband planning. So why? There's many that are probably on this webinar that understand the benefits of being connected to the internet. And sometimes that can be hard to quantify. So we try to help do that to not only convince communities that broadband is an important thing to have and that everybody needs to have digital equitable access to it, but to also arm folks across the country with information that they can use to then convince their own communities that this is something that we should be including in our master plans or comprehensive plans, or something that we should be addressing on our own. We should be working with our broadband providers and so on. So we want to make sure that we really understand the why of what we're doing. So, communities and planners are really great at planning everything. I mean, you just look at the roster of sessions for the National Planning Conference that's coming up here pretty soon, and there's topics that range from anything to everything: workforce development, open space, infrastructure replacement, bike paths, travel demand, bridges, all the fun stuff that we as planners get to do. But rarely is there a case where we're sitting down at a focus group in a public engagement session and talking about fiber construction, or learning more about fixed wireless or 5G mobile deployment in our communities. That's not always the case, but oftentimes we found that these types of conversations just don't happen. So if they're not happening, why should we care that they're not? Let's talk a little bit, before we get too deep into broadband, about exactly what it is, that we were all on the same page and we have a really common understanding of what broadband is and is not. So broadband really is any high-speed internet access that is always on and is faster than traditional dial-up. That's the very basic definition of broadband. It's anything but dial-up. When those types of connections have been around for quite some time now. When we start getting a little bit deeper into that definition, we really are looking at two different types of services. They are complementary, and equally important, but they are different. The first is what we call fixed terrestrial broadband. And these are services that are designed for permanent stationary use at a home, business, or institution. So the key word there is stationary. It's a connection that's always on in a home, at a business, at a library, at a school, and providing service to that entity. And these types of services include different technologies, including cable, fiber, fixed wireless, T1 lines, which is what I have to my house out in the country, and DSL, or internet over the phone lines. So these are the types of technologies that can carry that are considered a fixed terrestrial broadband signal. Cable has been around for years, providing broadband service. Fiber, of course, with all of the interest in Google Fiber a number of years ago, and many other fiber providers starting to spin up those types of connections in communities across the country. Fixed wireless is a technology that is often seen in rural areas. It's different than mobile wireless, like for your smartphone, in that, again, it's designed for that stationary use at a home, but it still relies on a wireless point-to-point signal to be able to provide that type of service. And of course, DSL over the phone lines with providers like AT&T and CenturyLink. So fixed terrestrial broadband excludes mobile connectivity, so your smartphone connectivity, and also satellite. Satellite broadband is excluded from that. So fixed terrestrial broadband is one, and then the second is mobile broadband. So mobile broadband is wireless service designed for continuous use on a portable device with seamless connectivity from one geographic location to the next. So again, the key word here is continuous. That would be the connections for your smartphone from any of the big four: AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, Sprint, and any other handful of others that there are out in the country. We know that many homes, especially in rural areas, rely on mobile broadband to be their permanent stationary connection, because there simply is no other option. So that's where the lines between fixed terrestrial and mobile tend to get blurred. But they are two different types of services, again, equally important, but they have very different frameworks, funding, business models, and capabilities. The FCC considers them separate. For what little regulation there is of broadband, they're regulated separately. But those are the two types of service that we look at when we talk about broadband. Satellite, of course, is of course it's a last resort type option for service. It's not considered fixed terrestrial or mobile. There are various issues with it, including latency, speed, and data cap issues that prevent it from being a viable option for home service. So those of you that may have satellite broadband service at home, you know the woes of having that type of connectivity. There's always, as technology changes so rapidly, we're going to have to watch and see what Elon Musk does with his low Earth orbit satellites promising gigabit level broadband service via satellite in the next few years. It's tough to change the physical distance between space and Earth unless you're going to bring those satellites quite low, which he plans to do. So we'll just be watching that one to see if satellite may become a viable option for that stationary home service in the future. So when we talk about broadband, again, when I said before that broadband is really anything but dial-up, that's true, but because the demands on broadband networks are ever increasing, it's typically associated with a speed. The definition of broadband is typically associated with a speed. So this chart shows how the speed definition of broadband has changed over time with the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. So back in 2009, when the National Broadband Plan was released by the FCC, the definition of broadband was 768 kilobytes per second. So again, barely better than dial-up, but still technically broadband. In 2012, the FCC created the Connect America Fund and reformed the Universal Service Fund, and that speed jumped to 4 megabytes per second. It didn't stay there very long when in 2014 that speed definition increased to 10 megabytes per second. And then it didn't stay there very long either, because in 2015, they're at an FCC meeting, they defined advanced broadband service as 25 megabytes per second. And this is when the net neutrality or Title II order went through. And we can, if you got questions on net neutrality, but happy to take those at the end as well. And the definition of broadband has stayed at this speed for quite some time, 25 megabytes per second as a download speed. And there's been lots of debate about this, but that's currently where we sit with the FCC definition of broadband. I'm going to talk a little bit later about a subsidy program called the Connect America Fund that you should be watching and know about for your communities. But they use the benchmark of 10 megabytes per second for that subsidy, the build out requirements for that subsidy. So the FCC kind of doesn't quite know where it wants to be between 10 megabytes per second and 25 megabytes per second. But those are the two speed standards that we have when we're talking about broadband speed definitions. So again, why do we care? Why does it matter that communities have this connectivity that we've just defined now? So through the research that Connected Nation has done in communities across the country, we've found that small businesses that use social media weekly are 3 times more likely to have recently hired for more positions than businesses that don't use social media. Again, that's that use component that I was talking about before. We've also found that small businesses with faster internet connections tend to have higher annual revenues than those with slower connections. And of course, bigger businesses with more revenue can afford to connect at faster speeds. But there is definitely a relationship between the two that we found through our survey research. We've also found that small businesses with websites have higher annual revenues and are more likely to have recently hired than those without websites. So how are they putting themselves out there with a web presence? And websites is one way to do that. And we've definitely found a link between the wellness of those businesses and their connectivity. We've also found that as digital literacy increases, that is how well the residents of a community understand technology. As that digital literacy increases, so too does the digital interaction between those residents and local businesses, or between those residents and their local government, or between those residents and their local healthcare institutions. So we're measuring 2 things here, the digital literacy of the community again, and that digital interaction, how often they're going online or using an app to access information and services from their community. We've also found that residents who do not typically telework have incomes that are only 75% of that earned by those who do telework with some frequency. So teleworkers tend to earn more than non-teleworkers. And we've also found that businesses with faster connections have a higher share of employees with advanced technology skills than those with slower internet speeds. So what does that say about the talent of a community when we provide them with faster internet connections? Others have found that in the first decade of the millennium, in rural counties that had high broadband adoption, that is, at least 60% of households in those counties subscribed to internet service, during that decade, income grew faster and unemployment grew slower. Similarly, in rural counties where they had low broadband adoption, so less than 40% of households had an internet connection, they lost more firms, more establishments, and lost more jobs during that same decade. So the access, adoption, and use of broadband matters when it comes to community and economic development. So how do we do it? How do we organize a community to work on planning for broadband? Broadband is often thought of as a private sector industry, and 95% of the time it is. So often it's tough to find the right people to talk to about the broadband infrastructure in your community. It can be a daunting task to try and analyze adoption use in a community, especially when that community is worrying about so many other things such as transportation and jobs and land use and all the other things that we as planners worry about. So I want to provide a kind of an overall organizing framework for you that you might be able to use to tackle broadband planning, or at least start to dabble in it as you work on advancing your master and comprehensive plans. So this is where at a theoretical level, if you will, we think that broadband planning really impacts communities. So starting in the upper left-hand corner here, we've found that many communities have experienced recession without recovery, job loss, population attrition, disinvestment, overall decline over the last few years, particularly in rural areas. And we believe that broadband and technology provide new means of access to education, economic activity, healthcare, government service delivery, workforce development, and so on. And that by participating in the strategic assessment, planning, and investment and improvements in that technology, access, adoption, and use in those areas, that we can start to affect change in these areas, then lead to greater leadership development in the community, family and youth retention, civic engagement, increased economic activity, human capital development, and so on, which then, of course, support greater community stability, sustainability, and growth. So the red box on this screen is really where that broadband and technology planning component fits in to start improving a community via technology. And the community planning efforts that we implement, and that many others have implemented as well, follow a basic process. There's no magic to the planning process. We engage a community, we assess and benchmark that community, we develop a plan, we implement that plan and promote it, and then start all over again, so that we can really develop a plan that is meeting the needs of the community and working to achieve their goals. So again, engagement, assessment and benchmarking, planning, and implementing and promotion. It's not a secret formula. It's pretty straightforward, but of course, when it comes to broadband technology, it provides its own little nuances, and every community is a little bit different. So when we talk about engaging a community, it's about team development. So we and you, in working with your communities, you know the stakeholders in your communities that represent the different sectors that are listed on the screen. So when we work with a community, as we have in the past, we try to find representatives in that community that represent these sectors and have a stake in broadband and technology, which nowadays is almost every sector in that community is impacted by technology. So we first try to find a community champion who can help bring all these folks together, and champions are very key to better understanding that community. Champions come from all over the place. We've had planners take on the role of champion in the community, using our skills as facilitators and conveners. Planners are great for bringing folks together. We've also seen champions come from the economic development community, local government officials, of course, and we've even had the education community step up and be champions for an effort. But finding the champion and then using that champion to develop a team is really the best way to start engaging the community around this subject. So the active community members from all of these sectors play a role in those communities, and they have an established rapport, but they might not have a rapport when it comes to technology. So it might it might not seem like a big deal to bring together the schools with the libraries, or the schools with the healthcare institutions, or the local governments together with public safety, but they don't often get together to talk about their technology needs. So that's why it's important to bring the team members together from a cross section of that community. And again, when you're working to write a master plan or a comprehensive plan, you want to bring input from the diverse array of folks in the community, and that's what this does. But we just focus on technology and broadband instead, and it's often the first time the community has actually sat down to talk about that particular topic. There we go. So moving on to the assessment and benchmarking. Planners love data. I'm a data nerd myself. It's something that we use to make sure that we're making the best possible decision we have with all the information that we can gather to move the community forward. So, of course, community planning efforts include the collection of a myriad of data points that help it to assess and benchmark them. It includes census data, natural features information, water, sewer, roads, land use, non-motorized transit, traffic counts. I mean, you name it, we gather all of this data together to create a master or comprehensive plan for a community. And oftentimes, broadband infrastructure is left out of that data collection. And especially if broadband is included in a master plan, it's usually because there might be some infrastructure data in there, but certainly information on the adoption and use of technology is a rare find in a master or comprehensive plan. But there's a reason for that, and it's often because data on broadband and technology is incredibly hard to find. The National Broadband Map that was created by the Department of Commerce has been dormant since 2014 until the FCC updated that map a few months ago, but with fairly shoddy information. So there went the chance of having more detailed information to be able to include in your master and comprehensive plans from the FCC. So it can be difficult to find this information. So you typically have to do some data collection of your own, or seek out non-traditional data sources that can provide a snapshot of the access, adoption, and use in your community. So some of the things that we look at when we're doing some broadband planning in communities, we do surveys. We do surveys of pretty much every institution that you can think of in a community, as well as the general public and businesses. So we look at things like, we ask businesses and residents what their connection speed is, what type of connection they have. We ask the digital literacy of the public. We ask libraries what kind of programs they offer to train folks on technology. We ask what types of e-government applications the local governments use, if they use any at all. We ask businesses about how well the technology skills of their employees match the technology skills of the technology needs of their business. So it's a fairly comprehensive and daunting process to collect all of this information, but other than collecting it yourself, data like this about your community and its technology use, access, and adoption really isn't available anywhere else. So I think asking the questions and putting surveys out there can be a long process, but it gives you data that didn't exist before and provides a very nice framework from which to build your broadband plan. We know where we are because we did this assessment, and we need to figure out where we want to be and fill in those gaps. And that's a very possible thing to do once you collect the local data on broadband. So then how do we use that data once we gather it? So I put this together, and it's a little messy, but it really starts to define the decision-making process about how we use that data to come up with solutions to fix the problems of broadband access, adoption, and use. So we start up here at the upper left. We figure out, okay, who's left offline? So because we collected information from all of our residents, we can figure out which groups in the community are most offline. And the example I chose here was, home broadband adoption or subscription is lowest among seniors. So okay, let's look at seniors then. So why are they offline? Well, we look at that data further and we see that digital literacy, or knowledge about technology, is a barrier for seniors. They've stated that they don't have an internet connection at home because they're not comfortable with the technology. Okay, so what's the issue then? Some of the things, some of the skills that they rated fairly low, that they weren't comfortable with, include cybersecurity, using multimedia, social media, office productivity, and mobile applications. These are things that they just didn't feel comfortable using, but stated that they needed to know. Okay, so if we know who's offline, we know why, and we know more specifically what the issue is, how are we addressing it? So because we did surveys of libraries in the community and other nonprofit organizations and educational institutions, we've found that office productivity and cyber safety are offered at many libraries, but social media, mobile applications, and multimedia training are very limited. So how do we fix it? Well, one solution could be to develop more aggressive and targeted marketing materials to these disconnected populations, so seniors, and make available that type of training that already exists to that population. The second would be to create and expand learning opportunities in those areas where we found we have a gap in our training in our community, and that way we can meet the community's needs. So by gathering data from the community that, again, isn't available anywhere else, we can start to map out how we start addressing the issues of access, adoption, and use in the community. Now, this is a skills scenario, but there's many other ways that we can use this data. So we found that, for example, businesses that have hired recently tend to be those with websites. So how do we increase the online presence of local businesses? So you can start asking all of these questions and use the data to come up with solutions that are very targeted, very efficient at plugging the gaps in the benchmarking and assessment that you've done to help create that plan. More often than not, you're going to find that you're going to have access issues, so infrastructure issues, and there's many ways that we can start to deal with those too. We find that we map broadband. We can figure out where it is or is not according to the broadband providers themselves. And then we use our survey data to better refine and validate that information so that we can identify hotspots in the community of demand where folks are saying that they're disconnected, and then work with the broadband providers, work to create partnerships to expand infrastructure into those disconnected parts of the community. We found that, of course, once we start implementing a plan, with any plan, that maintaining momentum beyond the creation of a plan can be difficult. I don't think there's anyone on here that would disagree that actually implementing a plan can be tougher than creating the plan itself, especially one that has a long-term vision. So to help with that, and because it's a topic that's a little non-traditional for communities, we like to advise that a community host a fairly large event to announce that the plan is complete, and that they can use it to build more implementation. So it does that kind of a press conference, if you will, type announcement does a couple of things. One, it makes the community very well aware of what the plan is coming out, that the community actually has a plan and they're going to work to implement it. And two, it holds the community team that you've established to create that plan accountable for its implementation. So it does work both ways in that we really want to make sure the community knows that the plan is in place, that there are resources available to them, and that the community can then hold the planning team accountable for that moving that implementation of the plan forward. And that's absolutely key. One of the biggest questions that we always get is about funding. So similar to maintaining momentum of plan creation, some of that momentum can be stopped by a lack of funding. So it can be difficult for communities to fund projects that come out of a plan, whether it's, again, for infrastructure or for implementing new, for example, e-government services, or again, creating new digital literacy training programs, or whatever it happens to be. Funding for those projects can be difficult to find. There are some federal grant programs, there are some state grant programs out there, and of course local efforts too to fund some of this effort might be possible, but it can be difficult to find funding for broadband, especially when it's outside of infrastructure. The USDA, the FCC, the Economic Development Administration, they all have funding programs for broadband infrastructure, very little for anything that has to do with, non-infrastructure related issues, such as adoption, affordability, digital literacy, and so on. So it can be difficult to find funding for broadband projects. But if you need resources for those, at the end I'll have my contact information, and I can let you know what some of those sources might be. There are, there's definitely something to be said for community foundations and private sector donors and volunteers to help implement a broadband plan. I've got some good examples of that local action later in the presentation to show how those types of entities can support local efforts for implementing a broadband plan. And one of the things that we try to do is, again, we've collected all this information now that assessed our community's access, adoption, and use of broadband. How do we use data tools then to help synthesize that information and visualize possible solutions? So this is one way to do that. So what we did here is we're visualizing survey results in conjunction with library locations in this community to help identify possible locations for new digital literacy training. This happens to be Spartanburg, South Carolina. The red dots on this map show clusters of residents that reported in their survey that they know very little about, or that they need to learn more about cybersecurity. So these are the folks that are struggling with cybersecurity when it comes to digital literacy, and it could be a possible barrier to broadband adoption among these households identified on the map. The circles on here are library locations, and the highlighted ones in that kind of purple color are those that might be good hosts for new training programs, simply because they have a cluster of residents reporting they don't know much about cybersecurity near them. So if you had limited dollars to implement a new cybersecurity training program, this might be a good way to help identify where those dollars could be efficiently spent and have the most impact on the community by identifying those places that have folks nearby that are struggling with cybersecurity as a barrier to broadband adoption. So promotion, I talked a little bit about hosting a big event, making sure it gets in the news, and this is something a lot of the communities that we've worked with have done. So they'll have a press release or a press conference style event. When the plan is released, they do a press release to make sure the community knows all about it. When the communities do their surveys, they ask for email addresses of participants if they want to be notified. They make sure that those emails go out, that they're aware that the plan has now been created and can take a look at it and be part of it. And then following that initial press conference of the plan release, they continually update the community on what's been going on. They make sure the community knows when a provider is going to expand into their neighborhood. They make sure the community knows when the library is going to be hosting digital literacy training. They make sure to make their school districts aware of the federal Lifeline program that provides a discount on broadband service for low-income households. So they make sure that the community is kept aware of what's going on with the plan and that they're involved to make sure that that plan gets implemented. So that promotional piece of the implementation process is pretty key, especially since broadband and technology are, again, non-traditional planning topics for many communities. So I want to share a few examples from across a few different states of communities who have taken up the mantle of broadband planning and what they're doing about it. When we talk about the things that communities are going to be addressing in these examples, there's a certain number of barriers to broadband expansion, and then the ways to overcome them. So I'm going to share some examples of all of these, but generally when we look at the barriers to broadband expansion, we're talking about a low density of households results in limited or no return on investment for delivering service. That's your rural problem. As you move away from urban and suburban and small town centers, household density, of course, drops off. So making a case for a private sector carrier to expand into those areas, they can't make a return on investment. That would be also true for public networks going into those areas. How can a publicly funded network, again, support itself to be able to expand into those areas? So a low density of households does result in a limited or no return on investment for delivering service. So we have to figure out how do we solve that type of problem. An additional barrier is that there's no federal, state, or local authority to require broadband deployment. Unlike universal phone service or electric service, there's no provision that demands a broadband provider build out to every single location within their service area. So without that, without that stick, it can be difficult to entice providers beyond a market-driven model to expand into rural areas. The process for installing broadband equipment or deploying equipment can be long and cumbersome. So dealing with different permitting agencies, access to the rights of way, attaching infrastructure to poles, all of those things can be cumbersome for broadband providers as they're looking to expand. And this is the next bullet here is about that idea of build it and they will come. So even when broadband is available, service can be out of reach for folks for a variety of reasons that we've talked about. So the cost of service, digital literacy, the awareness of why they should even have an internet connection. That barrier is slowly going away, but you'd be surprised at how many people still don't see enough value in having an internet connection at home to want to have a connection. And of course, all the things that make our communities absolutely beautiful and gorgeous places to live, like the terrain, the vegetation. In Michigan, we have lots of lakes. All of those things are physical barriers to expanding infrastructure, both wired and wireless. So there's a whole host of things to contend with when we're trying to reduce the barriers to infrastructure expansion and really the expansion of adoption and use of that technology in general. So how do we overcome that? Well, we can help to increase demand. So how do we help aggregate demand for broadband services, make that demand very well known, or increase that demand through the implementation of various electronic services? We can lower the capital costs of expansion. So how do we reduce or balance rights of way permit fees, pole attachment fees, and those types of things to lower the capital cost of expansion? We can again shorten installation times, so making sure that our processes are done in a very timely fashion, so broadband providers can get their infrastructure into the ground and expanded faster. Encourage affordability. The affordability of broadband is tough again because there is no regulation of cost when it comes to broadband. It's all market driven. So how do we help encourage affordability in communities so that vulnerable populations aren't left offline? And then finally, improving digital literacy and awareness. Those barriers can be easier to overcome once the infrastructure is there. So how can communities really work to improve those two things, which then of course increases demand, which helps spur infrastructure growth and so on and so forth. So here's a few examples of communities who have done it. So one example that I really like to give this example is Ogemaw County, Michigan, which if you're familiar with the geography of the state of Michigan is right in the middle of the Lower Peninsula, a little bit on the east side if you were to bisect it vertically. So the Economic Development Corporation there is cataloging vertical assets in their community. So what I mean by vertical assets are things like water towers, grain elevators, silos, anything that's tall enough for wireless equipment. And then they're aggregating all of those assets and marketing them to wireless providers so that providers can have additional options for locating their equipment and expand into rural areas. So this gets rid of that, or helps to get rid of that that low ROI. So if broadband providers can have access to a vertical structure without having to construct one themselves, they might be able to make a business case for expanding into low density areas. Clare County, Michigan, again, right in the middle of the state, home to the world famous Cops and Donuts donut shop. It's an extremely unserved community that has developed a number of public-private partnerships with internet service providers to help lower the capital costs for expanding wireless service. So in the case of Clare County, they had many very rural townships at the edge of their county that were unserved. And so the townships agreed to erect a tower on township property. They ran fiber to those towers. That was part of a schools, library, local government fiber ring. And then because those capital costs were lowered, a broadband provider was able to locate their fixed wireless equipment on those towers and provide service to very low density areas, which they would not have been otherwise able to do. if the public hadn't come to the table to create that partnership. Linden Township in Michigan is a rural bedroom community just outside of Ann Arbor, Michigan, home of the University of Michigan. And there were no broadband providers interested in serving their community. We helped bring in a number of different broadband providers to see if they could help solve their issues, and they all said they couldn't make it work. So last August, the township voted on millage to construct an open access fiber network for their residents, businesses, and institutions. And I believe they're in the construction bidding phase of putting that network in. I believe it was a $8.2 million millage, and they will be building that network, owning that network, and then leasing it to whoever wants to come and offer service to their residents. So that was their answer to solving their disconnectedness. Harbor Springs, Michigan. This is located at the tip of the Lower Peninsula of Michigan in wine country. They wanted to improve digital literacy and the online presence of businesses in their community. They saw that as a barrier. So they developed their very own digital literacy training platform, and they teach multiple classes every single month to residents and businesses alike to solve some of their issues. They have a very popular program called Wine and Web, where for a very low fee, you get a 5-course wine tasting coupled with a web development class, and it's sold out every single time they host it. So it's a very creative way of solving a digital issue in their community. They also opened a shared office space for teleworkers since they have a big teleworking population during the summer. Some additional examples here: Emmett County, Michigan, which again is located at the tip of the Lower Peninsula. They examined the county's zoning ordinances for any unnecessary local regulatory barriers that would inhibit the expansion of broadband, and they made some tweaks to their zoning ordinance to expedite co-location on towers that were already constructed, and then ease some of the regulations for new tower construction. They did that balancing act between the needs of the broadband providers and the health, safety, welfare of their community through their zoning ordinance. So Greenwood County, South Carolina, another example. There was a manufacturing facility that signed a construction contract with a local provider to bring in fiber optics, and it empowered the company to better support its national and international customers. So the company was at risk of leaving the community so that they could better support their clients. And instead, they worked with a local company to bring in fiber optics to improve their internet connectivity, and they were able to stay and make a case for staying because of that increased access to broadband. Wright County, Iowa. It's a very rural community looking to sustain and grow local establishments. So instead of going out and hunting for new businesses to locate to the community, they wanted to grow the businesses that they had there using the internet. So they developed an e-commerce training program for existing businesses to train them how to sell products online, develop their niche, expand their markets, and again, to sustain their local businesses. If they weren't going to be able to bring in new ones, they wanted to at least grow and cultivate the businesses that they had there. Story County, Nevada. There was a tower corporation there that partnered with the county to help enhance broadband service for local government offices. So it's a very rural location there in Nevada. And because the community had gotten together to talk about their broadband issues, they were able to bring the private sector to the table with the public sector and really, I like to call it airing their grievances. We're able to come to an agreement and understanding between each other to help improve the connectivity for local government. And then, of course, for all of the other residents and businesses in that community as well. So it seems like a very non-controversial or a very obvious solution, but it never would have happened if that community hadn't gotten together to simply talk about their issues and develop a plan for improving broadband. So I want to share some things now that there's some examples. I want to share some things that you might be able to do starting tomorrow. That's what I call it. There are ways that you might be able to start working on this issue, or at least start to learn more about it for your community. And there's a number of things that you could do. So the number one thing that I always tell folks is that you need to know your broadband providers. In Michigan, where I live, and we've been doing broadband mapping for years, there's at least 200 broadband providers in the state. Many of them are small. Many of them are technologies that you might not have heard of. And I bet that many communities here have access to providers that they don't even know about. So it's very important to better understand and get good local contacts for your broadband providers. And I know that can be difficult, especially for the larger national providers. It can be sometimes seem like they can be a little faceless, but it's worth it to try and find a local contact for your national broadband providers, as well as better understanding who your local maybe lesser known providers might be. So I say on here, and I put my email on here, that while we don't work in every state, Connected Nation that is, we've got relationships with at least 1,400 internet service providers across the country. That was from many of our mapping efforts over the years. So if you have trouble getting in touch with a provider or need a local contact for a larger provider, we can at least try and help you look for one, or help you better understand what providers there are in your community. Reviewing local regulations and consider removing barriers. Obviously, that's always a touchy subject. But after getting to know your broadband providers, one of the first questions you might ask is, well, what's preventing you from expanding in our community? Why aren't you serving X neighborhood? Or why don't you have routes running down XYZ streets? It's a touchy subject, but they might be able to help answer those questions. And the answers might be local regulation or local access to the rights of way. So we've created a guide, and I know the URL on here is long, which is why I'm leaving it up here for a while, if you wanted to click on it or write it down. But what we did is created a guide that has some best practices and examples of various local regulatory and policy actions that could be taken to help remove barriers. And again, these won't work everywhere, but they're just some ideas of things to look at if broadband providers bring up issues of local regulation and policy. The third bullet point here is bringing assets to the table. So before I talked a little bit about the different partnerships that were created in some of the communities that we've worked with. We've talked about vertical assets, and this map on here actually shows the location of the vertical assets in Ogama County that I mentioned. What could be brought to the table? Oftentimes local governments and other entities in the community, such as schools, libraries, higher education institutions, they have assets that could be brought to the table for use for broadband expansion, or can be brought to a partnership. Are there vertical assets? Are there towers? Is there land that could be used? Is there conduit in the ground that's not being used and could be leased for fiber installation? Is there fiber in the ground that might be dark or unused, that a community could use, or that they could lease to a broadband provider to use for expansion into rural areas, so they don't have to construct their own and tear up the streets again? Can you help expedite the right-of-way access? The right-of-way access is governed by many different layers, and it changes by state. But if there's ways that a local entity can help improve access to the rights-of-way, that definitely helps broadband providers deploy. The fourth one here, fine-tuning underserved areas. So this gets back to the surveys. So there are maps of broadband service available from the FCC. They tend to be overstated, especially when you get to a sub-county or sub-community level. So how do we better refine that information? Well, through the surveys that we implement to benchmark and assess a community for technology planning, we use those results then to help cut back some of that overstatement on the maps. So if you can help fine-tune those underserved areas, it makes it easier to make decisions about where infrastructure needs to be built and attracting providers to the table. On this slide, we're looking at follow the Connect America Fund deployment. So I didn't talk a whole lot about federal efforts, but the Federal Communications Commission has a program called the Connect America Fund, and that is a subsidy program that is giving money to broadband providers all across the country to build infrastructure out into rural areas. There's huge swaths of states that are included and eligible for this funding, and the build is currently going on right now. So I would definitely take a look and follow the Connect America Fund deployment. Just recently, actually the end of last week, was the deadline for broadband providers to submit their bids for additional funding to expand into what they call extreme high cost areas. So there's a lot of going on at the federal level, especially with broadband subsidies and build out, which is great. It still doesn't solve all of our problems, but it should be something that you're aware of and can track for your community. Similar to the bullet on the last slide in rights-of-way access, work with road commissions and right-of-way and pole owners. So it's always good to have a good relationship with the county road commission or the utility companies that own poles in the community, because broadband providers often cite those two entities as being a primary barrier to expansion. So how can community leaders work with and help mediate between those right-of-way owners and broadband providers to help come up with a solution that works for everybody? And finally, start a local broadband planning effort. So I provided the framework that I think works well for establishing a broadband planning team and plan in your community. And of course, if you have questions about those things, this is our website and my email address. Feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to help with any of these issues and answer questions. Again, broadband planning is not easy, and you can be wading into something that you're not familiar with. But again, more than happy to help, and it's something that at least I and we believe is necessary for improved community and economic development. So some final thoughts. So I did a survey of some planning friends of mine here in Michigan a few years ago who had been through a broadband and technology planning effort, either with us or otherwise. And so the quote here is actually from a regional planner. So broadband is a very different animal compared to land use planning, zoning, or community development. And then my favorite part is it is not for the faint of heart. You will take many steps blindly, but in the end, I believe our efforts were both necessary and successful in order to move the needle on broadband accessibility and availability in our region. So these were planners with no previous experience of broadband and technology, but they knew it was important for their community, so they jumped in with both feet to really help tackle the issue. And planners bring a whole plethora of skills outside of the technical skills for broadband. Again, that facilitation, that mediation, the public engagement side of things are very useful skills to bringing folks together around a topic. So when I asked them, why did you get into broadband planning? They said broadband is a critical component in a community's ability to increase its quality of life. The issues that they faced include funding and momentum, which we've talked about, but also education and understanding. They found that working to educate decision makers and elected officials about simply what the technology is, why it's important, and so on, was a big barrier. So we talked a little bit earlier about why we're doing this. So I hope that some of that data can be used to help educate and build understanding between the powers that be in a community as the planning process moves forward. So the skills, again, that planners bring and how they did this include the engagement, inclusiveness, consensus building, data gathering, facilitation, convening, partnering, all those things that planners are really good at when they might not necessarily know everything there is to know about a topic. They know about these things, and so they can bring the experts to the table to help facilitate a process. And the advice that they offered. So seeking collaboration and diversity, again, making sure that there's a very diverse group of folks around the table to talk about the topic, educating yourself, doing some research and figuring out exactly what this thing is, at least at a high level, knowing your providers, and finding neutral advocates and experts can also be difficult, but can also help balance the public and private sides of broadband planning. So I'm going to leave this here. It's got all my contact information on it. The two different websites that we have, one specifically for our community planning program, and then for Connected Nation in general. My email and phone number. Also, this is the first in a series of webinars on broadband. So the next webinar is May 18th, and that's on rural broadband business models. So that's for communities that may be looking into building their own network or participating in a partnership or so on. So it gets a little bit more specific there. And then the final one is understanding rural broadband technology options. So that delves a little bit deeper into the more technical side of things. So today was giving you this bigger overview of broadband and planning. Next will be kind of talking about the business models and how that might work. And then thirdly will be the more detailed discussion of technology options for rural communities. So I will stop, take a drink, and take any questions.
Awesome, thank you. And just so everyone knows, the next session in the series, which is on the 18th of May, you can go ahead and register for that now. And the last one in the series, which is June 15th, is not live yet, but stay tuned and you'll be able to register for that shortly. So with that, I hope that was enough time that you could take a gulp of water, and we're just gonna jump right into some questions now. The first one is, what is a typical procurement method for getting broadband from providers? So how do sweeteners or subsidies from communities get inserted into negotiations or requests for proposals?
Yeah, I think there's two ways. One is the RFP approach, and I think as part of that RFP or through strategic negotiations, after an RFP is awarded, I think typically most of the time those sweeteners would be getting any regulations out of the way. So ensuring that whoever wins the contract has unfettered access to the rights of way in a reasonable manner, of course, or that whoever's coming to the table, the community will establish what's called a one-touch make-ready program that they'll work with utility pole owners to make their poles ready to accept new infrastructure. So I think there's a number of different sweeteners to it, and I think they can either be spelled out in an RFP up front, as and because I think that would really entice broadband providers to come to the table and could help lower their potential bids for that project, considering some of that regulation might get out of their way, or they could be done afterwards in the negotiation between a potential winning bidder and the community.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What are your thoughts on municipal-owned broadband providers as opposed to commercial companies?
Yeah, I think municipally owned broadband is an option for many communities. It's the example I gave earlier was Linden Township, and they tried to bring broadband providers to the table, one after another, of every technology, and it didn't work. The providers simply said they couldn't serve the community, so they did it themselves. So I think that's a very viable option. Now there's some horror stories about communities that have tried to do a network and failed. Those were a number of years ago. I think a hybrid between a purely public and a purely private sector model works for a lot of places as well. Developing that public-private partnership, I think, is a good way to go. So even Linden Township, the example that I used, they're not going to be the internet service provider. They're just building the network and leasing it to an internet service provider. So again, it's a public-private partnership. So I think we want to see communities have as many tools as they can to get the connectivity to their residents that they need. So whether it's public, private, or anything in between, I think communities can find a way to connect their residents.
Thank you. Next question. In a comprehensive plan for a community, where would we be placing broadband infrastructure? Would it go under infrastructure, economic development? Where do you suggest it go?
No, that's a really good question, and I think there's two spots for it. There's either, if you have an infrastructure chapter where you address water, sewer, stormwater, electric, all that fun stuff, I think it would be another part of that chapter. Otherwise, we've seen it done in communities where a comprehensive broadband plan is tacked on as an amendment to an existing master or comprehensive plan, and that works well too, because oftentimes, and you bring up a good point, that broadband, it doesn't fall into any one bucket. I mean, it relates to land use, but it also relates to economic development. It relates to housing. It relates to a number of different things. So where does it sit? And that's kind of broadband's existential question when it comes to even how to organize broadband at a federal or a state level. So I think either doing it as part of a regular infrastructure section is okay. But I think the more popular way to go, and maybe the more useful, is to tack it on as a kind of an amendment, almost like you would do like a sub area, an after the fact sub area plan for a master, a broader master comprehensive plan.
Okay. Next question. Our small town is not getting any interest from the one DSL provider for a partnership, but we can't fund it alone. We'd prefer a partnership, but ideally with a provider that is more reliable and has a better reputation. We are overwhelmed. Is there hope that a new provider will come to our rural town? And if so, what are the primary things we can do to try to make that happen?
That's a tough spot, but it's not a spot that is unique to that small town. It's a really tough situation because we didn't even talk about competition for broadband today, but that is absolutely critical. So I think my advice would be to start looking beyond the borders of the town, and even multi-county distances away. Start finding other broadband providers that there might be. And again, there might be broadband providers that exist but that you aren't aware of, maybe not in your town, but again, in surrounding areas, and start conversations with them to see if they would be willing. Another thing to do would be to, maybe once you have those conversations, is to start to develop an RFP for the services that you are looking for. And sometimes that can attract attention from providers who may not have considered your community before, but didn't know what you were looking for. So I think number one would be to see if there's other providers in the area that, and when I say area, again, it's a broad area, I'd say within 50, 75 miles of where you are, to see if there's providers available there that could at least, that are willing for a conversation, and to see if you can start to define what it is you're looking for, and that might attract providers as well. But I think the number one would be to send me an email about where you're at, and we can provide some of that context too about other providers.
Okay, thanks. And I really do, like you said, I feel like that this is not an uncommon issue. Okay, next question. For urban counties or areas that already have broadband access, what type of activities should be covered in a broadband plan?
Perfect question. It comes down to adoption and use, right? Okay, so in the access, adoption, and use, you theoretically have the access taken care of. So what should we be working on next? It's that adoption and use. So how do we address those challenges? Well, one is, can we make broadband more affordable? Are there ways that we can help address the needs of vulnerable, low-income populations? How do we get the right digital literacy skills to the community so that they can use the technology that's already there? So checking on digital literacy with training organizations like libraries and schools. It's about awareness, so making sure people know how they can use the technology once they have it to improve their quality of life, whether it's here's how to access online educational opportunities, here's the telemedicine applications that our healthcare institutions are offering. So it's making sure that those three things, affordability, digital literacy, and awareness, are addressed in the community. And then finally, on the use side of things, is making sure that the institutions in the community are effectively using that technology. So going to the local schools and seeing if they have a one-to-one device program, or that they have the connectivity that they need. Making sure that local governments are leveraging technology to make services more efficiently available to their residents, and that residents can digitally interact with those local governments. So there's a lot that can be done without, when infrastructure doesn't need to be addressed. Those things tend to be a little bit messier because we're talking about things like socioeconomics and softer topics that are beyond infrastructure that planners don't usually deal with. But if you're looking at affordability, digital literacy, awareness, and then how all of the different components of that community are using technology, that's where I would take a broadband plan in an urban community that might have connectivity already.
Okay, thank you. Are you aware of the open access network model used by Utopia in Utah?
Utopia. That's not ringing a bell, but I'm familiar with open access networks. In that, again, I'll go back to the Linden Township example. They want to build a network that is essentially open to any provider that wants to come in and offer service on that network. That is how broadband was developed in Europe and in Asia, where big broadband pipes were built, fiber pipes were built to connect every location, and then providers would pay to lease space on those networks to provide service. So instead of having a choice of only one or two providers at home, you'd have one pipe coming into your home and have access to a myriad of providers that offer service on that network. So that's the idea there, is that it's one pipe but open to multiple entities to provide service. I'll have to look up the Utopia Utah project though.
Okay. Oh, and someone else just typed in Google bought Utopia. I don't know. That's just what came through. So there's that too.
Okay.
Okay. Where does your organization get its funding from?
Good question. So we do a number of fee for service type projects. For example, we work with many states to map and better refine the data that's provided to the FCC from broadband providers. So we have contracts with many states in the country to do that type of work. We also have communities that are funding broadband planning projects that we work with. We also are funded to do research by several entities. So it kind of comes in from all over the place. We're not a traditional nonprofit in that we receive funds from foundations and the like, unless it's for a project.
Okay, thanks. This is getting funny now. Okay, so someone just typed in, Google did not buy Utopia. Not sure where that came from. So we'll see where that goes. Okay, stay tuned, everyone. Okay, next question. You mentioned the attachment to existing utility poles. This is exactly where we are in Queen Anne's County, Maryland. The wireless telecommunications code speaks only to lattice towers and monopoles. Sprint has come through with technology that rests on utility poles. There has been heartburn because A, the code does not speak to such things, and B, DPW is exceptionally protective of such poles. We are in the process of rewriting the code. What are some of the pitfalls that we should be looking for and avoiding?
That's a good question, and it's a fight that's happening all over the country. And it deals with the deployment of technology for these forthcoming 5G networks that you may have heard about. So just a little context on the issue is that in order to support 5G networks, which are much faster mobile broadband connections for your smartphone, they have to, I hate this word, but they have to densify the network. In that they have to put up more access locations that are connected to more fiber to move the bits and bytes of your traffic on that faster connection back to the internet. So they needed to densify that network and make more access points. So yes, we've been seeing this all over the country. I don't know about any pitfalls. To me, I'm torn as a planner, but an advocate for broadband. Obviously, we want more broadband, but we also need to be able to protect the motoring public, the rights of way, and the poles themselves, as they usually support critical infrastructure. So I would just be careful that you're not giving away the farm in the rewrite of that ordinance, but that you're balancing the needs of the providers to erect their equipment. That's probably the best. I know it's not a solid answer, but it's probably the best answer I can give, because that technology and the requests for the installation of that technology are just booming right now. If you send me an email, there was a consortium in West Michigan that looked at this for many communities and helped streamline and get some best practices around it. So if you send me an email, I'll see if I can hunt down that organization and their resources that might be able to help you with that.
Thank you. Okay, next question. How do you recommend engaging in a comprehensive broadband plan for a community to ensure that the community's best interests are served? Specifically, when working with telecom providers, it can be difficult to find the expertise necessary to test and evaluate the recommendations and plans that a telecom provider puts forward in the planning process. For example, city engineers, engineering staff can review utility models, but not many public agencies have staff or even consultants that are skilled enough to understand radio frequency engineering and complex network infrastructure, not to mention new technologies that are just over the horizon.
Yeah, that can definitely be a challenge, especially for small communities. I mean, it's something that I even struggle to keep up with as the technology changes dramatically. The best answer I can give is to reach out to us, send me an email, because we have an engineering staff that can help with that, and I think that they have a document together that helps outline some of those technologies out there and what to watch for. So send me a note, and I can send that along the way. There's a lot of resources out there, and it's tough to put them all into a presentation. So send a note along, and I'll see what our engineering team has to help support those types of decisions. Because, like you said, it can be tough to make those calls and trust what the providers are saying. And I think a lot of it does come down to that trust. And I think, barring any other advice for examining those plans and evaluating those plans, getting to know the broadband providers and building that trust can be a very helpful step in making that happen. And again, for some communities that can be really easy to do, and in others it can be very difficult. But by building that trust and working together, I think you help eliminate some of that, the need for that distrust further down the road. But again, send me a note, and I'm going to see what our engineering team has that can help answer that question.
Okay, I think that takes care of our questions. So again, just to remind everyone, this session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits, and just check out our webcast webpage for the number or the event title to put in. And we will have a recording of the webcast on our YouTube channel, and we will have a PDF copy available on our webcast webpage. And I think that's it. So Eric, thank you. We look forward to chatting again with you for part 2 and part 3 of this. And everyone have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time.
All right. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.